Shortly after takeoff, the Tbilisi controller transmitted the latest weather observations from Sochi Airport, which reported a visibility of 2,000 meters and a cloud base at 170 meters. This immediately caught the flight crew's attention, as the minimum visibility required for runway 06 at Sochi was 2,500 meters. If the current conditions persisted at the time of their arrival, they would not be able to land. May 3, 2006. Zvartnots Airport, Yerevan, Armenia. Here, an A320 from the airline Armavia is waiting to depart for Sochi, Russia. Since gaining independence in 1991, Armenia has had several airlines that temporarily carried the country's tricolor flag before ceasing operations. One of them was Armavia, which began operations in the early 2000s and stood out in part for its decision to become the launch customer for the Russian-made Sukhoi Superjet 100 in 2011. Unfortunately, the costs associated with the new aircraft type and an economic crisis led the company to bankruptcy in October 2013. Throughout the airline's existence, the Airbus A320 and A319 formed the core of Armavia's fleet. Among the destinations served by Armavia was the Russian port city of Sochi on the Black Sea, nestled along a narrow coastline at the foot of the Caucasus Mountains. Armavia operated several flights between Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, and Sochi International Airport, including the overnight Flight 967, which was scheduled to depart shortly before 1 a.m. local time. The normal flight duration was approximately 1 hour. A total of 105 passengers were booked on the midnight flight, along with 8 crew members, consisting of 2 pilots, 5 flight attendants, and a maintenance engineer. The pilot in command was Captain Grigor Grigoryan, 40, who had learned to fly in the Soviet Union, beginning his career with the Antonov An-2 biplane. He later flew the Yak-40 for Armenian Airlines and Ararat Avia before joining Armavia as an A320 pilot in 2004. The second in command was First Officer Arman Davtyan, 29, who received his initial training in Russia in the late 1990s, flying the Tupolev Tu-154 for Sochi-based Chernomor Avia and later for Armenian Airlines, Armenia's original flag carrier, until its bankruptcy in 2004. He later joined Armavia as an ATR-42 co-pilot before being promoted to A320 first officer that same year. Before departure, the flight crew received the dispatch documentation, including the weather reports for their destination. At that time, Sochi was reporting visibility of 2,700 meters with light rain and fog, and a cloud ceiling at 1,200 meters. However, the forecast indicated that by the estimated arrival time of Flight 967, the cloud ceiling would drop to 210 meters, with intermittent fog reducing visibility to just 800 meters. The weather wasn't bad enough to prevent departure, but the conditions were marginal enough that Captain Grigoryan decided to take on enough fuel not only to fly to their alternate airport in Rostov-on-Don, but also enough to turn around and return to Yerevan. At 12:47 a.m., after loading the requested fuel and completing final checks, Flight 967 began its takeoff roll. They lifted off smoothly and headed north. "12 minutes after departure, the crew contacted the Tbilisi Area Control Center in Georgia, which cleared them to climb to their cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. Minutes later, the Tbilisi controller transmitted the latest weather observations from Sochi Airport, which reported visibility of 2,000 meters and a cloud base at 170 meters. This immediately caught the flight crew's attention, as the minimum visibility required for runway 06 at Sochi was 2,500 meters. Runway 02, which lacked an instrument landing system, had even higher minimums, 3,000 meters of visibility and a cloud base at 220 meters. If the current conditions persisted upon their arrival, they would not be able to land. Now cruising steadily at 34,000 feet, the crew preemptively contacted the Sochi approach controller to hear the latest weather report directly from the source. At most major airports, this would typically be done by tuning into the Automated Terminal Information Service, ATIS, but Sochi lacked such a system. Armavia 967, we are currently below minimums here. That is, on runway 06, the cloud ceiling is at 170 meters, visibility 2,000, and the minimums are 170 by 2,500. And on runway 02, the ceiling is 170 meters, visibility 2,000. That runway requires 220. With significantly more fuel on board than was needed for the trip, the flight crew was willing to take the risk of holding over the airport and waiting for conditions to improve above minimums, but only if the forecast showed a general trend of improvement. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth the trouble. The controller took some time to get this information from the meteorologist, but at 1:16 a.m., Sochi Approach contacted them again. The forecast in 2 hours is 150 by 2,000. Are you telling me the conditions will be worse in 2 hours? That's right. What will you do then? What do you mean, what will we do? Return to Armenia. Resigned to the fact that they couldn't land in Sochi, Captain Grigorian and First Officer Davtyan turned around and began the return to Armenia via Georgia. This flight could have ended here, but by a twist of fate, it didn't. 10 minutes after turning back, the crew decided to give it one last try. At 1:26 a.m., they contacted the Sochi approach controller again to ask about the weather conditions, but this time, they ominously added that there were authorities on board. In reality, there were no authorities on board. By implying that there were, the crew hoped to pressure the controller into giving a more optimistic weather report. Needless to say, having authorities on board doesn't magically improve the weather. Personally, it's hard to understand what the pilots were thinking. A few minutes later, the controller called back with the latest weather update. Armavia 967, visibility 3,600, cloud ceiling 170 for the next 30 minutes. These conditions were slightly above the minimums, so the captain decided it was good enough to turn back towards Sochi. In the cockpit, the pilots prepared for an ILS approach to runway 06. During this time, they also received instructions on the missed approach procedure. I hope he doesn't make us divert when we're already on approach. Don't talk to him too much. The less communication we have, the less chance he'll make us turn back. This conversation indicated that the flight crew was mentally committed to landing in Sochi and prepared to take potentially unreasonable actions to achieve that goal. Having already decided to divert and then changing their minds, they may have felt increased psychological pressure not to make the same decision again, something that would frustrate the passengers and potentially the airline. It was at this point that the first signs of an adversarial relationship with the Sochi controllers began to develop. In their conversations, the pilots described their interactions with Sochi approach as a negotiation rather than a simple exchange of information. As if the reported weather conditions were decided by the controller's mood rather than by Mother Nature. Moving into the next phase of the flight, Captain Grigorian led the descent and approach briefing, and at 1:52 a.m., they received clearance from Rostov Area Control to begin descending to 21,000 feet. The pilots immediately selected the new target altitude and then pressed the vertical speed button to activate the autopilot-controlled descent mode. However, Captain Grigoryan seemed dissatisfied with the descent rate resulting from that mode selection. It's not descending. What's wrong with this thing? At this rate, we'll get bad data again and won't be able to land. He then pulled the altitude knob outward to engage open descent mode, which is pilot-controlled. As a result of this selection, their descent rate increased from 5 meters per second, 1,000 feet per minute, to 12 meters per second, 2,400 feet per minute. At 1:58, the crew was cleared by Rostov Center to descend to 11,900 feet, and at 2, they were instructed to contact Sochi Approach for further instructions. After establishing contact, the Sochi Approach controller informed them at 2:01 that the current visibility was 4 kilometers, with a cloud ceiling at 180 meters amid light rain. These conditions were still above approach minimums. In response to the report, Captain Grigoryan decided to initiate the approach. At 2:03, the radar controller cleared Flight 967 to descend to 2,100 feet and begin a right turn to final approach, heading 060. Seconds later, Captain Grigoryan began the turn using the autopilot's selected heading mode, which has a maximum bank angle of 24 degrees. Because they were in a sustained descent without the landing gear, flaps, or speed brakes extended, their indicated airspeed had already spiked to 280 knots, too fast for this stage of the approach. To make matters worse, they were still descending through 10,000 feet, about 3,000 feet above the expected altitude at that point in the approach, making it difficult to reduce speed without worsening their altitude issue. Armavia 967, you are too far to the left. Adjust heading to 090 to intercept. You didn't have to say it. We already did it. Over the next 3 minutes, the pilots exchanged heated remarks, using incendiary language to refer to the controller. At 2:06, after reporting that they were now at 2,000 feet, Grigoryan activated the autopilot's approach mode to prepare for intercepting the instrument landing system. At that moment, the controller called to halt the descent. Do not continue descent. Maintain 2,000. The cloud ceiling had dropped to 160 meters, when the minimum for landing was 170. What are you saying? Now? You belong in a mental hospital. The pilots set the flaps to position 1, just in case the controller quickly gave them permission to land. Apparently, the pilots felt that extending the flaps after being instructed not to land was an act of defiance. Seconds later, the captain ordered flaps 2 and reduced the selected airspeed to 133 knots in preparation for flaps 3 and finally flaps full. At 2:09, the pilot's gamble paid off when the radar controller called and said, RNV 967, contact tower 4,000 by 190. With visibility at 4,000 meters and the cloud ceiling once again above the 170-meter minimum, they would almost certainly be cleared to land. Captain Grigoryan immediately ordered the landing gear down, while First Officer Davtyan contacted Sochi Tower to report that they were inbound and ready to land. In the end, he lost. Sometimes you win, sometimes... This guy just wants to give us a heart attack. Captain Grigoryan increased the airspeed to 137 knots, then called for flaps full. They went through the landing checklist, And just as they were about to finish, the controller contacted them again. Armavia 967, stop descent. Clouds have dropped to 100 meters. Turn right and climb back to 2,000 feet. When conditions fall below landing minimums, the approach must be discontinued, as a safe landing is unlikely. In most of the world, this responsibility formally lies with the aircraft captain. But Russia is one of the few countries where air traffic controllers have the authority to make that call. So the pilots had no choice but to comply, though, as they had throughout the flight, not without shouting and swearing in the cockpit. But instead of advancing the thrust levers to toga mode and engaging the go-around procedure, Captain Grigoryan, while cursing, first pressed the push to level off button, which does exactly what it says. He also used the heading knob on the FCU to select a southeast heading of 172 degrees to initiate the right turn, as instructed by the controller. Grigoryan began moving the rudder pedals, something that isn't necessary in the A320. The fact that he was trying to use the rudder suggests that Grigoryan was already beginning to lose situational awareness. As Grigoryan began the turn, the tower controller repeated the instructions and told the crew to contact radar control. While doing so, Grigoryan, again without saying anything, increased the selected altitude on the FCU from 2,100 feet to 3,200. But there was no obvious reason to do this, as the missed approach altitude was the 2,100 feet they were already approaching, and it had already been selected moments earlier. Open climb mode was activated, and the autopilot pitched the nose up sharply to begin climbing at 8,000 feet per minute. At the same time, the autothrust attempted to increase power to maximum climb. But the engine response was too slow to prevent a drop in airspeed, triggering an automatic low-energy warning that shouted, "Speed, speed, speed," through the cockpit speakers. This warning was triggered largely because Flight 967's crew was operating outside the range Airbus had intended. Since the aircraft was still in landing configuration with gear down and flaps full, the drag on the plane was so high that engine response wasn't fast enough to prevent the airspeed from dropping when the autopilot initiated the steep climb. Why is the selected altitude at 3,200? Set it to 2,100? Didn't you already do that? Set it to 2,100. When Davtyan selected 2,100 feet on the FCU's altitude window, the flight director reduced pitch since the selected altitude was now closer to the actual altitude. At the same time, the captain reduced thrust. But at this point in the go-around, they still hadn't realized that the aircraft was still in full landing configuration, with the gear down and flaps set to full. The aircraft was slowly climbing at a comfortable 163 knots, with altitude and thrust correctly configured, and Grigoryan was banking 20 degrees to the right, exactly as required in Sochi's missed approach procedure. At 2:12:28, the tower controller repeated the instruction to contact radar control, which had still not been done. As First Officer Davtyan reconfirmed the instruction, Captain Grigoryan, without saying anything, began pushing forward on his side stick to lower the nose, leveling off before reaching the missed approach altitude. He pushed the side stick enough to pitch the nose below the horizon, putting the aircraft into a descent. Now, due to the low pitch angle and high thrust setting, the aircraft was accelerating, and in the darkness and fog, there were no external visual references. 1 second later, Grigoryan shouted, "Flaps!" As the speed increased, he likely saw on his screen that they were approaching the maximum flap extension speed, which reminded him they hadn't been retracted. First Officer Davtyan immediately set flaps to position 2, but before they could fully retract, the flap speed limit was exceeded, triggering a cockpit overspeed warning. The aircraft, now banking 33 degrees to the right and pitched 5 degrees nose down, entered an increasingly tight spiral as alarms blared in the cockpit. Davtyan retracted the flaps to position 1, where the maximum speed was 215 knots. But with the engines at climb power and the nose down, they were accelerating so quickly that this did not silence the overspeed warning. At the same time, Captain Grigorian pushed his side stick even further forward, pitching the nose down to minus 11 degrees. 6 seconds later, at 2:12, First Officer Davtyan shouted, "Level it out!" Almost simultaneously, the ground proximity warning system began to sound. Realizing something was going terribly wrong, Davtyan grabbed his own side stick and pushed it fully to the left in an attempt to stop the steep right bank. Unknowingly, he made the situation worse. In grabbing the control forcefully, he also pushed forward, which drove the nose down even more. Grigorian acknowledged the GPWS alerts and began pulling back on his side stick to raise the nose, but since both he and Davtyan were making opposite inputs, it had no effect.
Terrain. Pull up.
Not understanding why the aircraft wasn't responding, a panicked Grigorian screamed, "What's happening?" At 2:13:03, Armavia Flight 967 crashed into the surface of the Black Sea at a speed of 285 knots. In an instant, 113 lives were lost forever. What had happened? Was there something wrong with the A320? Or were the pilots entirely to blame? Immediately after the crash, Sochi controllers tried to re-establish contact with the aircraft without success, and within 3 minutes, an emergency was declared. But due to poor visibility, rescue helicopters could not take off, and ships had to be dispatched to the crash site. The site was first discovered at 8:08 a.m. the next morning, when a vessel operated by Russia's Ministry of Emergency Services found an oil slick and debris. By 11:30, bodies were being recovered from the water. In Armenia, the reaction was one of shock and grief. The crash was by far the deadliest air disaster the country had ever suffered, both before and after independence, and both Armenia and Russia declared periods of national mourning. Recovering the black boxes took several weeks of underwater reconnaissance, but the cockpit voice recorder was eventually found on May 22nd, and the flight data recorder was located 40 meters away on May 24th. Using the black box data, the MAK and Airbus conducted a detailed performance study to determine whether the aircraft had responded normally to the commands it was given. This would reveal the presence or absence of external factors such as icing, wind shear, or mechanical failure. The analysis found nothing unusual. As far as investigators could tell, the aircraft behaved according to its design specifications and responded as expected to both pilot and autopilot inputs throughout the flight. The human causes of the crash were neither simple nor immediately obvious, but together they provide a picture of how the pilots slowly lost control. While climbing with the autopilot disengaged, the captain, under significant psycho-emotional stress, input nose-down commands due to a loss of pitch and roll awareness. This initiated the abnormal situation. His inadequate pitch control inputs led to a failure to recover the aircraft and ultimately caused the crash. In addition to the captain's inadequate control inputs, contributing factors included the first officer's failure to monitor pitch attitude, altitude, and vertical speed, as well as the crew's inadequate response to the GPWS warnings. The controller's unexpected go-around order, delivered in a high-stress environment, pushed Captain Grigorian over the edge, and he began making critical errors. Instead of following the go-around procedure, his immediate priority became carrying out the controller's very specific instructions, without recognizing that those instructions aligned completely with the standard go-around. As a result, he did not activate the go-around mode or call for retraction of the flaps and landing gear. Tragically, investigators concluded that the crash could have been avoided at nearly any point if the pilots had worked together to execute terrain escape by applying toga power and pulling their side sticks fully back. In fact, the flight path only became unrecoverable about 5 seconds before impact. As a result of their findings, the MAK issued 22 safety recommendations. The crash marked the beginning of a difficult period for Armenian aviation. Just one day after the accident, another Armavia A320 was damaged beyond repair in a hangar fire in Brussels, further worsening the airline's financial situation. Armavia itself ceased operations in 2013. Although the country has not suffered a major crash since, concerns about Armenia's lack of state oversight capacity led the European Union to ban all Armenian airlines from its airspace in 2020.